Hello. It started with a phone call I wasn't supposed to answer. The landline barely rang these days, a relic from when Linda insisted we needed a backup in case our cell phones died. I was in the garage, tinkering with the lawnmower, when I heard the sharp trill echo through the house. Linda had just left for one of her weekly volunteer shifts at the community center. I let the first ring go, then the second, figuring whoever it was would hang up. But something about the persistence, the way the shrill sound cut through the stillness, made me wipe the grease from my hands and head inside. I picked up the receiver and said hello. A man's voice came through, rough, rushed, and angry. Where the hell is she? It took me a second to process the words. Excuse me? I said, gripping the phone tighter. Don't play dumb, Frank. I know she's with you. The familiarity in his tone stopped me cold. He knew my name. And worse, he thought Linda was with me. Who the hell is this? I shot back, my voice hard. He didn't answer right away. There was a long, drawn-out pause, then a scoff. Of course, you don't know. She probably told you I don't exist. I tried to respond, but he hung up before I could get another word in. For a few moments, I just stood there, the dial tone humming in my ear. It wasn't just the call itself that unsettled me. It was the venom in his voice, the way he said her name like it was his to own, the quiet implication hanging in the air. Linda hadn't been acting like herself lately, sure. She'd been coming home later and brushing off my questions with the same old excuses. But this was something else entirely. I hung up the phone and stared at the wall, my mind racing. Whoever that man was, he just cracked open a door I wasn't ready to walk through. But now, I couldn't ignore it. Something was wrong, and I wasn't about to wait around for Linda to explain. I grabbed my keys and headed out the door. It was time to start asking questions. When Linda came home that evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table. I'd wiped it clean of its usual clutter, the salt shaker, the stack of unread mail, and sat there with nothing but the phone receiver in front of me. I wanted her to see it as soon as she walked in. A silent accusation. She stepped inside, her tote bag slung over her shoulder, her hair a little disheveled. It was almost as if she had stepped out of someone else's life and stumbled into mine by mistake. She froze when she saw me sitting there, her eyes flicking from my face to the phone on the table. Everything okay? She asked, a little too casually. I ignored the question. Someone called today, I said. My voice was steady, but my insides were twisting. A man. He seemed to know you. Her expression didn't shift the way I expected it to. No startled denial, no panicked scramble for an explanation. Instead, she set her bag down on the counter and looked at me with the calm precision of someone deciding how much to say. What did he want? She asked. He wanted to know where you were. I waited for her to flinch, to show some crack in her composure, but she just shrugged. Probably a wrong number, she said, her tone clipped. Linda, I said sharply, and her head snapped up. He knew my name. He knew yours. This wasn't a wrong number. There it was, finally, a flicker of something in her eyes. But it wasn't guilt. It wasn't even fear. It was annoyance. Like I was wasting her time. She reached for the kettle and started filling it at the sink, her back to me. I don't know what you want me to say, Frank. People get confused. It's not worth losing sleep over. She was brushing me off, and I felt the anger rise in my chest. I wasn't going to let her deflect this. Not this time. This guy was angry, I pressed. He seemed to think you were supposed to be with him. So I'll ask you again. Who was he? Linda turned off the faucet and set the kettle down, her hands gripping the counter for a moment before she turned back to face me. Her face was hard, her eyes narrowing slightly. I have no idea who called, and I don't know why you're acting like this, she said. Her voice was calm, controlled, but there was an edge to it. You're making something out of nothing, Frank. Maybe you need to get out more. Find a hobby or something. It was the kind of thing she'd been saying a lot lately. Subtle little digs at how I spent my time, as if the problem was with me, not her. I'd let it slide before, chalking it up to stress or frustration. But now, in the wake of that call, it felt like a calculated distraction. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. You've been different lately, I said. You're out more. You're quieter when you're here. And now this guy calls. And you expect me to believe it's a coincidence? Her jaw tightened, but she didn't respond right away. She just stood there, staring at me like she was waiting for me to give up and drop it. But I wasn't going to drop it. Not now. When the silence stretched too long, she finally spoke. I think you're being paranoid, she said. You're reading into things that aren't there. But the problem was, things were there. Things she didn't realize I'd noticed. Like how her tote bag had changed in the last few months, how she'd swapped the plain canvas one for a more expensive leather one that didn't fit with her usual style. Or how she'd started buying takeout for herself instead of cooking at home, despite always insisting we eat dinner as a family. Little details that added up to a bigger picture. And then there was her phone. It wasn't the phone itself. It was how protective she'd become of it. How she kept it face down on the table and took it with her everywhere, even when she went to the bathroom. I hadn't thought much of it at first, but now it felt like a piece of a puzzle I hadn't known I was putting together. I let her finish her performance of indifference, then stood up. I'm not buying it, I said. But you can keep playing this game if you want. I'll find out the truth eventually. Linda's expression didn't change, but her eyes followed me as I walked out of the kitchen. I could feel the weight of her stare on my back, a mixture of anger and calculation. The next day, I called a friend of mine, Tony, who worked as a contractor. He had a side hustle that wasn't exactly legal, but it wasn't dangerous either, installing discreet surveillance systems for people who wanted to keep an eye on their employees, their kids, or their spouses. I told him I needed a setup for the house, and I didn't give him much more detail than that. He didn't ask. By the end of the week, I had cameras in the living room, the kitchen, and the front and back doors. There was no sound, just video feeds that I could check from my phone. I wasn't proud of it, but I wasn't going to let Linda keep me in the dark. For a while, nothing happened. Linda came and went as usual, always with the same explanations about work or errands. But one day, while I was reviewing the footage, I noticed something strange. She had come home in the middle of the afternoon, a good 3 hours earlier than she usually did. She didn't have her bag with her, and she wasn't wearing her usual shoes. She looked out of place, like she didn't belong in her own home. I watched as she walked into the living room and pulled something out from behind the couch cushions. It was small, black, and rectangular. Something she slipped into her pocket before heading upstairs. The footage wasn't clear enough to tell what it was, but I didn't need to see the details to know it wasn't good. My instincts told me whatever she was hiding, it wasn't something I was supposed to find. I had planned to keep gathering information, to bide my time until I had enough evidence to make her admit what was going on. But the moment I found that second key, everything changed. It was tucked away in the pocket of her jacket, the one she usually wore to her so-called volunteer shifts. A plain key with no label or tag, but it wasn't for anything in our house. I checked every lock, closets, drawers, the garage door, and nothing matched. The realization hit me like a freight train. This key was to somewhere else, somewhere she went when she wasn't here. That night, I sat at the table again, the same way I had when I confronted her about the phone call. This time, though, I wasn't waiting for her to tell me something. I was going to get answers, and I didn't care how uncomfortable things got. She came home a little later than usual, her jacket draped over her arm and her face carrying that faintly guarded look I was starting to recognize. When she saw me sitting there, she hesitated. "What's with the key?" I asked, holding it up between my fingers. Her eyes flicked to it, then back to me. "Where did you find that?" she asked, her voice steady. "In your jacket," I said. "You want to tell me what it's for?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she set her jacket on the back of a chair and moved to the sink, turning on the faucet as if she hadn't heard me. "Linda," I said louder this time, "what's the key for?" She sighed, shutting off the water. "You're going through my things now? Is that what we're doing?" "Don't turn this around on me," I snapped. "This isn't about what I did. This is about what you're hiding. Where does this key go?" She leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. For a moment, she just stared at me, her expression unreadable. Then she shook her head. "You're making something out of nothing, Frank. It's just a key. It doesn't mean anything." "Then it shouldn't be a problem to tell me what it's for," I said. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and I could see the wheels turning in her head, searching for a way out. "It's for a storage unit," she said finally. I waited, but she didn't elaborate. What storage unit? I pressed. I got one a few months ago, she said. I needed a place to keep some old things, stuff from before we were married. It was taking up too much space in the house. It sounded plausible enough, but something about her tone didn't sit right. She was too measured, too rehearsed. Show me, I said. What? Show me the storage unit. If that's what the key's for, then let's go see it. She hesitated, and I saw the faintest flicker of panic in her eyes. Frank, it's just a bunch of old boxes. There's nothing to see. Then you shouldn't have a problem proving it, I said. Unless you're lying. She straightened, her expression hardening. You're being ridiculous, she said. I don't have to prove anything to you. You're acting paranoid, and I'm not going to entertain this. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. I'm done with the excuses, Linda, I said. If you've got nothing to hide, then prove it. Otherwise, I'll find out on my own. Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought she might actually agree. But then she grabbed her jacket and walked past me toward the stairs. Good night, Frank, she said, her voice cold. I watched her go, my fists clenched at my sides. She thought she could shut this down by walking away, but she was wrong. This wasn't over. The next day, I skipped work and went to the nearest self-storage facility. It didn't take long to find the right one. Her name was on the paperwork. The unit itself was small, no bigger than a walk-in closet, and the lock clicked open easily with the key I'd taken from her jacket. Inside, it was exactly as she described. Boxes stacked neatly along the walls, labeled with things like winter clothes and books. But when I opened them, the contents didn't match the labels. One box that was supposed to contain clothes was full of folders and paperwork. Another labeled kitchenware held nothing but old photo albums and a laptop. I opened the folders first. Most of them were filled with receipts and bank statements, but there was one envelope that caught my attention. Inside was a series of hotel receipts, all for the same place, all dated within the last 3 months. I felt my stomach drop. The laptop came next. It wasn't locked, and it didn't take long to find what I was looking for. Email exchanges, calendar entries, and photos. All of them pointed to one thing. Linda had been meeting someone regularly, and it wasn't for volunteer work. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing with what I'd found. When Linda walked through the door that evening, I didn't wait for her to speak. Who is he? I asked. She froze, her eyes widening slightly. What are you talking about? The hotel receipts, I said. The emails. I know, Linda. So stop lying to me and tell me the truth. Who is he? Her face paled, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it. But then she sighed and sat down at the table, her hands trembling slightly as she folded them in front of her. It's not what you think, she said quietly. Then tell me what it is, I said. She looked up at me, her eyes pleading. I didn't mean for it to happen, she said. It was just, I don't know, a mistake, a distraction. A mistake? I repeated. A distraction? Linda, this has been going on for months. You don't accidentally check into a hotel with someone over and over again. She flinched, but she didn't argue. Who is he? I asked again. She hesitated, then said a name I didn't recognize. He works with me, she said. We started talking during lunch breaks, and it just got out of hand. Out of hand, I said, my voice rising. You're my wife, Linda. Do you have any idea what you've done? Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel sympathy. I felt betrayed, angry, and stupid for not seeing it sooner. I'm sorry, she said, her voice breaking. Sorry isn't good enough, I said. You destroyed our marriage, and for what? Some guy you work with? She didn't respond, and the silence between us was deafening. I want you out of this house, I said finally. You can pack your things tonight, but I don't want to see you here tomorrow. Frank, please, she said, reaching for my hand. I pulled away. Don't, I said. You made your choice. Now live with it. She didn't argue. She just nodded, tears streaming down her face as she stood and walked upstairs. I listened to her footsteps fade, my heart pounding in my chest. The confrontation was over, but the fallout had only just begun. After Linda left, the house felt empty. Not just quiet, empty. But I didn't have time to dwell on it. I needed to take control of the situation before it spiraled further. Sitting back and letting her walk away wasn't enough. Not after what she had done. She needed to feel the consequences of her actions. The first step was making sure she didn't get to keep living her life as if nothing had happened. I had access to more of her personal accounts and files than she probably realized. Over the years, she'd left me with enough breadcrumbs, details she never bothered to hide because she thought I was too trusting to notice. She'd been careless, and now I was going to use that against her. I spent the better part of 2 days poring over everything. Emails, text backups, and her bank statements. The receipts from the hotel weren't the only troubling entries. There were charges for gifts, expensive dinners, and even plane tickets I'd never heard about. It didn't take a genius to figure out that these weren't for us. She hadn't just been unfaithful. She had been living a second life behind my back. I decided to make the first move before she could. My first stop was her workplace. Linda worked at a mid-sized consulting firm, and while I didn't know all the details of her day-to-day tasks, I knew enough to get the ball rolling. I walked into the office building late in the afternoon, just as most people were getting ready to leave. I didn't ask for Linda. I asked for her boss. When her supervisor, Mr. McGrath, appeared, I introduced myself and explained that I had something urgent to discuss. His expression shifted as I told him about the affair, about how Linda had been meeting a colleague, someone who, based on her own confession, worked there. "I'm not here to cause a scene," I said, keeping my tone measured. "But this has gone far enough. Your office is a professional environment, and what's been happening here isn't just unprofessional. It's disrespectful to everyone involved." McGrath looked uncomfortable, but I could tell he was listening. Offices like Linda's prided themselves on maintaining appearances, and the last thing they wanted was scandal. By the time I left, I had the satisfaction of knowing Linda's carefully crafted image was beginning to crack. If she thought she could juggle her affair and her career without consequences, she was about to learn otherwise. The next step was more personal. Linda had always been proud of her social circle, of the network of friends and acquaintances she had cultivated over the years. They were her allies, her confidants, the people she relied on to maintain her sense of self-worth. But they didn't know what she had done. Not yet. I started with a simple email, one I sent to her closest friends. I didn't mince words. I told them about the affair, about the lies, about how she had destroyed our marriage. I attached the hotel receipts and a few screenshots from her emails, proof that couldn't be denied. I knew what I was doing wasn't kind, but kindness wasn't the goal. The responses came quickly. Some of her friends were shocked, others outraged. A few tried to defend her at first, but the evidence spoke for itself. Slowly but surely, the tight-knit web Linda had built began to unravel. I wasn't done yet. Linda had always insisted on maintaining joint accounts, something I'd agreed to out of convenience more than anything else. But now that convenience was working in my favor. Before she could make any moves, I transferred the majority of our shared savings into an account in my name. It wasn't theft. I left enough to cover the basics. But I wasn't about to let her use our hard-earned money to fund her escapades. I also canceled the credit card she'd been using. When she called to complain about it later that week, I kept my response short. "You don't get to use me anymore," I said. "Figure it out on your own." Her anger came through loud and clear, but I hung up before she could say much more. Finally, I turned my attention to the house. Legally, it was in my name, something we'd agreed on when we bought it. I made it clear that she wasn't welcome back, not now, not ever. I changed the locks the same night she left. But the most satisfying part of my revenge wasn't the financial hits or the fractured relationships. It was what came next. Linda had left her laptop behind in her rush to pack up and leave, and while I didn't have much hope of finding anything new, I decided to take a look. What I found was better than I could have anticipated. There were emails between her and her lover, details about their plans, their meetings, even photos they had shared. But there was something else, too. Emails she had sent to his wife. Yes, his wife. Linda hadn't mentioned this part, of course, but the emails made it clear that her lover wasn't as unattached as she had pretended. He had a wife and kids, a whole other life that Linda had willingly inserted herself into. It was almost laughable, the hypocrisy of it all. I printed the emails and mailed copies to his wife. I didn't include a return address, but I knew they would speak for themselves. It didn't take long for the fallout to reach Linda. A week after I sent the letters, I got a call from her. This time, her voice was panicked, not angry. "What did you do, Frank?" she asked. "I told the truth," I said simply. "Something you should have done a long time ago." "Do you have any idea what you've done to my life?" she said, her voice rising. "Do you have any idea what you've done to mine?" I shot back. She didn't have an answer. The conversation ended there, and I didn't hear from her again for several days. But I didn't need to. The damage was done. I knew Linda well enough to understand that she thrived on control, on being the one to dictate how things unfolded. By taking that control away, by exposing her lies and forcing her to face the consequences of her actions, I had done what I set out to do. She was no longer in control, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was. It was late, just after midnight, when Linda called again. I almost ignored it, but something made me pick up. Maybe I wanted to hear her beg, to see if she had anything left to say after everything I had exposed. But the moment I answered, I could tell something was different. Her voice wasn't angry or defensive. It wasn't even apologetic. It was shaky, quiet, almost too quiet. "Frank," she said, and then paused like she didn't know where to start. "I need to tell you something." "What is it now?" I asked, my voice cold. "Haven't you said enough?" She exhaled sharply, like she'd been holding her breath. "No, I haven't. I've been keeping something from you, and I need to tell you before this goes any further." I leaned back in my chair, my jaw tightening. "What could you possibly say at this point, Linda? You've already destroyed everything. What else is there to confess?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment, I thought she might have hung up. But then she spoke, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Frank, it wasn't just me and him." I froze. "What?" "There were others," she said, her voice cracking. "It wasn't just him. I've been seeing other people for a while." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. "I don't know why I'm telling you this now," she continued. "Maybe because you already hate me, and I don't have anything left to lose. Or maybe because you deserve to know the truth. But it wasn't just him. There were others before him, and—" "How many?" I interrupted, my voice low and steady. "What? How many others, Linda?" She hesitated. I don't know. A few." "A few?" I repeated, my grip tightening around the phone. "Do you even hear yourself right now? How long has this been going on?" Another pause. Then, quietly, "A year. Maybe more." I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. A year. She'd been doing this for a year. Or longer. And I had no idea. I thought back to all the times I'd defended her, trusted her, given her the benefit of the doubt. All the times she had looked me in the eye and lied. "You've been lying to me for over a year," I said, my voice shaking. "And now you're just casually telling me there were more? Like it's some throwaway detail?" "I'm not trying to make excuses," she said quickly. You're just what?" I snapped. "Trying to clear your conscience? Trying to dump the rest of your lies on me so you can feel better about yourself?" Her voice grew frantic. "I didn't want it to come out like this. I didn't want you to find out at all. But you—" "But I what? Figured it out? Started asking questions? Sorry to ruin your perfect little charade, Linda." "It wasn't perfect," she shouted suddenly. "Do you think I'm proud of this? Do you think this is what I wanted?" "You tell me," I shot back. "Because it sure as hell looks like you've been enjoying yourself while I've been sitting here like an idiot, thinking I had a wife I could trust." There was a long silence. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. "It wasn't about you, Frank," she said. I laughed bitterly. "Of course it wasn't. It's never about me, is it? It's always about you." "That's not what I meant," she said quickly. "I'm saying it wasn't about anything you did or didn't do. It was, I don't know. I felt stuck, like my life was on autopilot. I didn't feel like myself anymore." "And your solution to that was to sleep with every guy who gave you attention?" I asked. She didn't respond. I stood up, pacing the room as I tried to process what she'd just told me. A year of lies. A year of betrayal. And now, She wanted me to believe it wasn't about me, that it was some abstract crisis she couldn't articulate. "I don't even know who you are anymore," I said finally. Her voice broke. "I don't know who I am either, Frank." I stopped pacing, gripping the edge of the counter as I tried to calm the storm raging inside me. For a moment, I thought about hanging up, about ending the conversation and walking away from the wreckage she had made of our lives. But I couldn't. Not yet. "What do you want from me, Linda?" I asked quietly. "I don't know," she said. I wanted to tell you the truth. All of it. Because I can't keep living like this." I shook my head, even though she couldn't see me. "You should have thought about that before you started destroying everything." "I know," she said. "And I'm sorry. For everything. I know that doesn't mean much, but I am." Her words hung in the air, heavy and meaningless. "Frank," she said after a long pause, "what happens now?" I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. "What happens now," I said, "is you move on with your life, and I move on with mine. Separately." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, but she didn't argue. "Is that what you want?" she asked finally. "It's what needs to happen," I said. Another silence. Then, softly, "I understand." "Good," I said, "because I'm done. This is the last time we're having this conversation, Linda. I don't want to hear from you again. Not unless it's about the divorce." "Frank." "Goodbye, Linda." I hung up before she could say anything else. For a long time, I just stood there, staring at the phone in my hand. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt suffocating instead of peaceful. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a strange sense of finality. It wasn't closure, not yet, but it was a step, and that was enough for now. I didn't sleep much after that final conversation. The house was too still, too quiet, and my thoughts were anything but. Every word Linda had said played on a loop in my mind, each one cutting a little deeper than the last. The revelation about the other men was still raw, but it was the way she'd said it, as if it didn't matter anymore, that stuck with me. For days, I felt like I was moving through fog. I went to work, answered emails, took calls, and did everything I was supposed to do, but it all felt mechanical. People around me noticed, of course. My coworker David asked if I was okay during a lunch break. I told him I was fine, which wasn't true, but I wasn't about to unload my personal life in the middle of the break room. I knew I couldn't stay in that limbo forever. The anger, the confusion, and the endless replaying of Linda's betrayal. It was all eating away at me. I had to figure out what came next. The first thing I did was meet with my lawyer. I wanted the divorce to be quick, clean, and final. There was no reason to drag it out. We didn't have kids, and the house was in my name, so there wasn't much to fight over. Linda had already started staying with one of her friends, which made things easier. "I'll get the paperwork drafted," my lawyer said after I explained the situation. "Once she signs, you'll be able to move on." Move on. It sounded so simple when he said it, but I knew it wasn't going to be that easy. Over the next few weeks, the practical aspects of the divorce kept me busy. I packed up Linda's things and left them in the garage for her to pick up. She came by once while I was at work, and by the time I got home, her things were gone. I didn't feel relief seeing the empty space where her boxes had been, just an odd kind of emptiness. Despite everything, there were still moments where I felt a pull to reach out to her, to demand more answers or rehash what had already been said. But I forced myself to resist. Talking to Linda wouldn't fix anything. She'd made her choices, and I had to live with the consequences. One evening, while going through some old files, I found a folder labeled Anniversary Trip. Inside were printouts of reservations I'd made years ago. A weekend getaway I'd planned for our 5th anniversary. I remembered how excited I'd been, how much I'd wanted to make it special. I also remembered how Linda had canceled at the last minute, claiming work was too busy. I tore the papers in half and threw them in the trash. The real turning point came about a month after the papers were filed. I was at the grocery store, walking down the frozen food aisle, when I spotted someone who looked familiar. It was a man, mid-30s, dressed casually, but his face triggered a faint recognition. It wasn't until he glanced up and saw me that I realized who he was. It was him, the man Linda had been meeting at the hotel. I stopped in my tracks, unsure of what to do. He looked equally startled, and for a moment, we just stared at each other. Then he gave me a tight, awkward nod and turned his cart down another aisle. I stood there for a long time, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to follow him, to confront him, to say something, anything. But what was the point? He wasn't the real problem. He was just another symptom of the disease that had infected my marriage. I let him walk away. That night, I sat down with a notebook and started writing. Not a letter to Linda, but a list. Everything I'd learned from the past few months. People aren't always who you think they are. Trust isn't a guarantee. It's earned, and it can be lost. You can't control what someone else does, but you can control how you respond. Moving on isn't about forgetting. It's about accepting what happened and deciding what you want your future to look like. The list grew as I wrote, and by the time I was done, I felt a small sense of clarity. I couldn't change what Linda had done, but I could decide how much power I let it hold over me. The divorce was finalized 3 weeks later. Linda didn't fight it, and the process was as straightforward as I'd hoped. When I signed the final papers, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and something else I couldn't quite name. In the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding. I redecorated the house, not because I wanted to erase Linda's presence, but because I needed it to feel like mine again. I started going to the gym more regularly, joined a local trivia team, and even picked up an old hobby, woodworking, that I'd abandoned years ago. It wasn't an overnight transformation. There were still hard days, moments where I felt the weight of everything that had happened. But slowly, I began to feel like myself again. One afternoon, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was Linda. "Hi, Frank. I hope you're doing okay. I just wanted to say I'm sorry again for everything. I know I can't undo what I did, but I hope you found some peace. Take care." I stared at the message for a long time before deleting it. Some people might have found closure in responding, but I didn't need to. Linda's apology didn't change anything. My peace didn't come from her. It came from knowing I had survived, that I was still standing, and that my life was my own again. I wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I was ready to find out. Thanks for watching. Rate the story in the comments. Subscribe to the channel. Bye-bye.